Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of During Bible Study Podcast. I'm your host, Steve Kitts, and I'm glad you're here with me. We're going to get back into Job chapter 1, starting in verse 14. I think we're going to go through 17 in this episode. We're continuing this journey. It's a powerful chapter that reveals the trial of a man who was tested beyond imagination, yet remained faithful to God. In this episode, we're going to explore how Job faced one heartbreaking report after another, the significance of these moments in his story and what they mean, and what we can learn from his response in facing these overwhelming losses. So grab your Bible, find a comfortable spot, shut the world out, and let's get into this word together. Verse 14. And there came a messenger unto Job, and said, The oxen were plowing, and the asses feeding beside them. Now this is the arrival of a messenger. You remember he had quite a few people to work for him. He had a mass amount of commerce, a lot of goods, a lot of animals and people that work for him. Now this is introduction to the first of the series of calamities that will befall Job. The messenger arrives bringing alarming news, interrupting Job's normal life. The oxen, they were used for plowing and represents that Job's agricultural wealth. The donkeys, or asses, were essential for transportation and carrying loads, another symbol of Job's prosperity. Their mention highlights the magnitude of Job's material blessings and significant loss that he is about to endure. We all know that animals have a limited lifespan normally, but this event was quick and sudden. It said the oxen were plowing and the donkeys were feeding, indicating this was a normal day at work on Job's estate. This emphasizes the suddenness of a disaster and how it can drastically change in an instant. Now, Job's wealth and possessions were the foundation of his earthly securities, and they're about ready to be stripped away. Remember, God gave permission to the devil to test Job. And this is what the enemy went off quickly to do, is to destroy things that Job has. This verse begins to show how material wealth can be fleeting. It can be here one moment and gone the next. The mention of oxen and donkeys underscored Job's extensive responsibility as a steward of God's blessing. It highlights how deeply his losses will impact him, both materially and emotionally. Now this messenger, it signals the start of Job's trial. This is the first sequence of the devastating reports, illustrating how trials often come in waves, one after another, just like the waves of the ocean. They come, just keep coming. While Satan initiates the attack, the sequence of the fall events happen only with God's permission. Now, this demonstrates God's control even in allowing trials to test the faithful servants, me and you. If you're going through something, don't blame the devil always. Know that it's something that God has allowed to happen, and he knows that you're strong enough to come through it, that you will be faithful to him. Now these verses remind us of the calamity that can strike at any time, challenging us to trust God rather than in our possessions or our circumstances. The loss of Job and his experience here is not random, but they're used to reveal and refine his character, showing that true faith depends on God, not material wealth. Like Job, we should view our material blessings as a gift from God to be used for his glory, recognizing that these blessings are temporary and hold them loosely. Now, life can change unexpectedly. Cultivating a deep trust in God ensures stability when faced with any hardship or a loss. Now, Job's story encourages believers to prioritize external treasures over earthly possessions, which can be taken away in a moment. Job 1:14 marks the beginning of Job's trial. With the loss of his oxen and donkey, it signifies the start of his material decline. This verse serves as a reminder to trust God's sovereignty and to hold on faithfully even when life circumstances are abruptly turned upside down. Verse 15, and the Sabaeans fell upon them and took them away. Yea, they have slain the servants with the edge of the sword, and only am I escaped alone to tell thee. That attacked the Sabaeans. The Sabaeans were likely marauders or a nomadic tribe known for raiding, always on the move, hit and miss, guerrilla warfare tactics. They attacked Job's property, taking away his oxen and his donkeys, and killing the servants that took care of them. This event marks the first wave of calamities in Job's series of trials. Now, who were the Sabaeans? The Sabaeans were an ancient people that was mentioned in the Bible as coming from a nation far away from Israel. And we see that in Joel 3 and 8. They were a people of stature from Isaiah 45:14, and a rival nation to Israel in Job 1:15. The Sabaeans lived in the land of Sheba, which archaeologists suggest that it was a Semitic trade nation that existed for over 1,000 years in the area that is now known as Yemen. The capital of Sheba is called Marib. The kingdom existed from 2000 BC to 275 AD, trading primarily in spices. The land of the Sabaeans were eventually destroyed as a result of a civil war. The Sabaeans featured in 3 biblical passages that we mentioned earlier. The first, which chronologically speaks, is in the book of Job. Job was hit with a successive set of tragedies, one after another, and one of them was the attack of the Sabaeans. Now, these raiders stole Job's oxen and his donkeys and struck down the servants with a sword, leaving only one man alive to run back and report this back to Job. The next 2 biblical events involved the Sabaeans were prophecies by Isaiah and Joel. Isaiah prophesied about Israel's eventual victory over 3 cultures, the Egyptians, the Cushites, and the Sabaeans. The men of Sheba are called those tall Sabaeans in Isaiah 45:14, meaning they were apparently men of stature and strength. Isaiah's prophecies of all 3 of these groups will eventually be humbled before Israel and admit that Israel's God is the one true God. This is Isaiah 45:14. They will bow down before you and plead with you, saying, surely God is with you, and there is no other. There is no other God. Now, in Joel's prophecy, the Sabaeans are mentioned as a distant nation of whom the men of Judah will sell their enemies as slaves, and the sign of God's punishment over Tyre and Sidon, nations who declared to come against God's people. And we see that in Joel 3:4 through 40.
I am Joseph M. Warner, the host of Christitutionalist Politics Podcast. Hoping you will tune in every weekend. Also hoping you will watch for the companion Christitutionalist Politics book, Politics from a Christian-based U.S. constitutionalist perspective. Thank you all. Take care. God bless.
Joel 3:4 through 8. The Queen of Sheba, or the Queen of the South, who traveled a long way to hear Solomon's wisdom, was likely a Sabaean. And the elaborate riches that she gave Solomon shows that the Sabaeans were a wealthy people. Centuries after her visit to Jerusalem, 2 warring clans fought over the control of Sheba and eventually weakened the empire that was overtaken by the Himraket kingdom. At this point, the mighty Sabaeans ceased to exist as a distinct people. Now let's talk about the slaughter of the servants, though. The Sabaeans were ruthless, killing Job's servants with the edge of a sword. This adds a layer of personal grief to Job, as these people were under his care and his responsibility. He was to protect these people, and they shouldn't have been killed. The escape of the messenger one servant escapes to deliver this grim news. The phrase "I am only the one that escaped alone to tell thee" emphasizes the total loss and set the pattern repeated in the sequential calamities. The Sabines represent human action as a source of suffering. While Satan orchestrates these events, human actors are used to carry out the destruction. The oxen were essential to Job's livelihood. Losing them severely impacts his wealth and ability to provide, underscoring the magnitude of the trial. This verse begins to reveal how external events challenge Job's faith in God's goodness and sovereignty. We can imagine getting this news when you're not expecting it. While Satan sought to harm Job, this event was permitted by God within the set boundaries. Satan took his attack all the way to the boundary, right to the edge that God had set. This illustrates that even in chaos, God has complete control of everything. Job's trial affects his possessions here, his relationship, which was the loss of his servants, and his sense of security. Whenever you get attacked, your alarm goes up, your senses go up, and you get on the defense. You don't want it to happen more or something else to happen. So you've automatically changed your normal routine to a status of awareness. The destruction brought by the Sabines highlights Satan's goal to inflict pain and suffering through any means available. When suffering comes through human actions, it is essential to remember that God is still in control and working for his purpose. Job's loss of the oxen and the donkeys remind us to hold material possessions lightly and steward them well, knowing that they are only temporary. Like Job, believers are called to trust God's goodness and his plan, even when circumstances seem overwhelming or unjust. In Job 1:15, it shows us the first strike of Satan's assault on Job, using human forces to inflict suffering. This verse reminds us that the trials can come unexpectedly and painfully, yet God's sovereignty and purpose remains constant. It calls us to place our trust in God and respond to the suffering with faith and perseverance. Verse 16, while he yet speaking, there came also another and said, the fire of God is fallen from heaven, and hath burned up the sheep and the servants, and consumed them, and I only am escaped alone to tell thee. Remember we talked about waves. The second calamity hit right as soon as the first was announced. This first messenger finished delivering the news of Sabine's raid. Then another messenger arrives with more tragic news. This quick succession of disasters emphasizes the overwhelming nature of Job's trial and how the enemy likes to pack it on. He don't hit you just once. He hits you successively over and over and over. The phrase fire of God is likely referring to a lightning storm, a natural event associated with divine power in the ancient thoughts. This fire caused widespread destruction, consuming Job's sheep and the servants who tended the sheep. The use of fire of God could imply that those witnesses that seen this event interpreted it as an act of divine judgment or power. Now, this shows too a complete loss of the sheep. It destroyed them all. This is a significant blow, as sheep was a crucial part of the wealth and livelihood. The death of the servants added a personal and relational dimension to this tragedy, and yet another messenger escaped. Seems like the enemy's always got somebody to report something bad to you, don't he? Similar to the first calamity, one servant was spared to report this devastation, and he repeated that same phrase, I only am escaped alone to tell thee. While this calamity appears to be a natural disaster, it is part of Satan's plan to test Job. This shows that Satan can influence events even in the physical world, but only within the limits that God allows. We had a hurricane that came through and a flood that devastated the East Coast. And recently we've had a fire and high winds that destroyed a lot of California. Could they be the work of the devil? I don't know. But I know that each disaster can bring people closer to God. That might happen for some, but most only choose to stay close for a little while. Job's trial affects every area of his life. The devastation of the livestock loss further undermines his economic stability. The sudden, unexpected nature of the events tests Job's faith in God's justice and goodness. Now, the term fire of God may lead others to believe that Job was under divine punishment. This is a misunderstanding that foreshadows the accusers that would later be made by Job's friends. Although Satan orchestrated the lightning, it occurred only under God's permission. This illustrates that even in chaos, God's still in the ultimate control of everything. Job had no explanation for the calamity other than the appearance of divine judgment. Faith in such moments requires trust in God's character beyond our understanding and our circumstances. The use of natural forces reminds us that the earthly events often have spiritual dimensions unseen by us humans. The sudden calamities can challenge our faith, but they also provide opportunities to deepen our trust in God's sovereignty and His care for us. It's important not to assume that someone's suffering is due to divine judgment or punishment, as Job's friends would later do. We are called to offer compassion and understanding instead of judgment. Trials may have purposes beyond what we can see. Believers can rest in the knowledge that God works all things for the good of those who love Him, and that's Romans 8:28. Now, Job 1:16 reveals another layer of Job's suffering as the natural disasters strike his livelihood and more of his people. While the fire of God might seem like a divine judgment, it is part of Satan's plan to test Job's faith. Satan wanted Job to be mad at God. That's why he let that guy use that phrase. This verse challenges us to trust God's sovereignty and purposes, even when faced with overwhelming or unexplained losses. Verse 17, while he was yet speaking, there came also another, and said, the Chaldeans made out 3 bands, and fell upon the camels, and had carried them away, yea, and slain the servants with the edge of the sword, and I only am escaped alone to tell thee. Waves, I'm telling you, one after another. That's the way he hits us. The third calamity. As the second messenger finishes his reports of destruction of the loss of Job's sheep and servants, the third messenger arrives with more devastating news. The quick succession of disasters leave Job no time to process or recover from it. It's wham, 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 one after another. The Chaldeans, they're another nomadic group, more like people from Mesopotamia. They raided Job's property. They were organized into 3 bands and moved strategically, indicating a coordinated attack to overwhelm Job's defenses. This raid resulted in the theft of Job's camels and the murder of his servants that took care of them. Who were the Chaldeans? After the fall of Assyria in Mesopotamia, a great group of Semitic people dominated the area. Suffering mightily under the Assyrians, the city of Babylon finally rose up against the hated enemy, the city of Nineveh, the capital of the Assyrian Empire, and burned it to the ground. The chief of the Babylonians, Nabopolassar, the Semites living in the northern part of Mesopotamia, would never gain their independence again. Nabopolassar was succeeded by his son Nebuchadnezzar II, and Nebuchadnezzar was equal to all the greatest Mesopotamian conquerors from Sargon onwards. Now, he not only prevented major powers such as Egypt and Syria from making inroads to his territory, but he also conquered the Philistines in the state of Judah and the southern Jewish kingdoms that remained subjugation of Israel, the northern kingdom, by the Assyrians. In order to secure the territory of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar brought Joachim, Zedekiah, the 2 kings of Judah, in succession, and held them in Babylon, sort of like a political prisoner. Keeping the Assyrian practice, the new Babylonians, or Chaldeans, forced a large group of the Jewish population to relocate. Numbering possibly up to 10,000, these Jewish deportees were largely upper-class people and craftspeople. Their deportation marks the beginning of the exile in the Jewish history. Under Nebuchadnezzar, the city of Babylon was rebuilt with great splendor. The Jewish people knew how to build stuff, and he used them. And it would eventually become the most magnificent human cities in the area in the Middle East and Mediterranean. But not all was perfect beneath the shining surface. There was still existing a number of cities that were loyal to the Assyrians. The entire period dominated by the Babylonians, in fact, is the first period of the great unrest of the Babylonian hegemony was continually tested by the Philo-Assyrians. This conflict slammed the door on the Babylonian Empire under the dynasty only 5 kings. Babylon in 555 BC came under the control of the loyalty to the Assyrians, Nabonidus, who attacked the Babylonian culture at its heart. He placed the Assyrian moon god Sin above the Babylonian principal god Marduk, who symbolized not only faith in Babylon, but in the very city and the people itself. Angered and bitter, the priests and those faithful to Babylon would become Cyrus the Conqueror of Persia, would welcome Cyrus the Conqueror of Persia into their city and end the forever Semitic domination of Mesopotamia. The center of the Middle Eastern world shifts to Cyrus' capital, Susa, and would shift again later to the Greeks and then to the Romans. For almost 2.5 centuries, Mesopotamia and Babylon were at its center, dominating the landscape of the early civilizations in the Middle East, to finally eclipsed by the sun of the Indo-European cultures to the north and to the west. The Chaldeans were people who lived in the southern Babylon, which would be the southern part of Iraq today. Sometimes the term Chaldeans were used to refer to the Babylonians in general, but normally it refers to the Semitic nomadic tribes that lived in the northern part, but normally it refers to the specific semi-nomadic tribe that lived in the southern part of Babylon. The land of the Chaldeans was the southern portion of Babylon or Mesopotamia. It was generally thought to be the area around 400 miles long and 100 miles wide along the Tigris or Euphrates River. The Chaldeans are mentioned multiple times in the Bible, both in context. For example, in Genesis 1:28, it speaks of Abraham's father Terah, who lived in Ur of the Chaldeans, home of the specific tribe or the people known as the Chaldeans. We know from this verse that in Genesis 11:31 and Genesis 15:7 that God called Abraham, which is the descendant of Shem, out of Ur of the Chaldeans, also that Abraham would follow God to the land that God had promised him and his descendants. The Chaldeans were intelligent and sometimes aggressive, warlike people. In 731 BC, Nebuchadnezzar, a Chaldean, became king of Babylon. However, his reign was short-lived. A few years later, Merodach Baladan, also a Chaldean, became the king over Babylon. Then in 626 BC, Nabonidus, another Chaldean, began what would be an extended period of time during which Babylon was ruled by a Chaldean king. During this time, the word Chaldean became synonymous for Babylon, and we see many verses in the scripture where the word Chaldean was used to refer to the Babylonians in general. We see that in Isaiah a lot. Successors to Nabopolassar was Nebuchadnezzar, Amalekmerek, Nahmadius, then Belshazzar, all kings of the Chaldeans. We see those in Daniel 5:30. At the height of the Babylonian Empire, the Chaldeans were an influence and highly educated group of people. Some historians believe after Persia conquered Babylon, the term Chaldeans was often used to refer to the social class of highly educated people that were left over. The Chaldeans' influence on Nebuchadnezzar's decision to throw Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego into the fiery furnace in Daniel 3 and 8 were well known as wise men and astrologers during the time of the Jewish captivity in Babylon. Now, another side note to that, these same people, in theory, some people believe that the wise men that came to visit the baby Jesus were from this group of wise men and Chaldeans and astrologers that lived in Babylon that later moved after this into another country far away, but they still remembered the stories of how God delivered the 3 Hebrew children from the fire, and they knew the history and the story of the coming king. But back to our story. At the time of Daniel, the Babylon was an intelligence center of Western Asia, and the Chaldeans were renowned for their study and knowledge of astrology, and they kept detailed astronomical records for over 360 years, which can help understand how the wise men from the east would have been able to recognize and follow the star that would lead them to the King of the Jews in Matthew 2 and 2. Now back to our story of the loss. The significance of the loss of the camels. Camels were a symbol of wealth and were essential for trade and long-distance transportation in the ancient world. Losing the camels not only reduced Job's material wealth, but also his ability to maintain his trade networks and sustain his household. Again, we have a sole survivor. As in the example of the previous 2 calamities, one servant survives with tragic news. I only am escaped alone to tell thee, reinforces the rapid and overwhelming nature of Job's trial. In this instance, Satan uses again human enemies, the Chaldeans, to inflict suffering on Job. This shows that Satan can use people to carry out a destructive plan, though it's still under God's permission. We can see how he uses those close to us even today to bring news and to spread rumors or to cause personal hurt. Some people think about church hurt when somebody at the church or somebody that you trust that you go to church with that says something or does something that hurts you. That could be one instance of it. I'm not saying it is, but it's a possibility. It's out there. Job's suffering is comprehensive, affecting his livestock and his servants and his ability to engage in a trade. Each layer of loss clips away at Job's security and his stability. Let's talk about the 3 bands, suggesting that the attack was deliberate and calculated, emphasizing the level of planning that went behind Job's affliction. Although Satan orchestrated the attacks, they occurred under God's sovereign allowance. This reminds us that nothing happens outside God's control, even when human agents are involved. Job is not privy to having heavenly conversations and knowing what was happening between God and Satan. But his ability to remain faithful despite not knowing the reason behind his suffering highlights his trust in God's character. The loss of the camels and the servants further isolates Job, testing whether his faith depends on material wealth or remains steadfast in God. As Job faced the undeserved attacks, he may encounter situations where others harm us without cause. Our response should mirror what Job's faith was, trusting God to bring justice in his time. The trials we face might be unseen of the spiritual dimensions, reminding us to remain vigilant in our prayer and our faith in God. That is why it's so important to stay in God's Word and to study and watch for the enemy's attack, because you know that he will. And we talked about the waves, how he just don't do one thing. He attacks with this, and then he throws this on top of it, and then he throws this on top of it. He keeps on attacking. But we need to remain faithful, strong in the Lord, hit our knees and battle him that way. Let God be in control. We can't control things anyways. It's all God's goodness and His grace on our life. Job's situation encourages believers to remain faithful and steadfast, even when facing life's losses and feeling overwhelmed. In Job 1:17, the Chaldeans' raid marks another layer of Job's suffering, stripping him of more wealth and more resources. This verse demonstrates Satan's use of human agents to bring destruction, but also highlights Job's resilience and his faith in the face of expansionary trials. It reminds us to trust God's sovereignty even when faced with suffering and loss. Well, we're going to stop right there and we'll wrap up this episode of During Bible Study Podcast. I've been your host, Steve Kitts. I thank you for joining me, and I know that Job is something that people think they know, but you really got to look at it, and you got to really know what's in there. And together we'll get through this, and we'll be better for it. We thank God for your time with us, and God bless you. to take a minute to talk to you about Buzzsprout. Today is a great day to start your own podcast. Whether you're looking for a new market or a channel, may I suggest that you share your thoughts and your ideas with the world. And it's just so fun to have a talk show. Podcasting is very easy, inexpensive, and a fun way to expand your reach online. Buzzsprout is hands down the easiest and best way to launch, promote, and track your podcast. Your show can be online and listed in major podcast directories like Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, iHeartRadio, and many more within minutes of finishing each recording. Podcasting isn't hard when you have the right partners, and a team that they have at Buzzsprout is passionate in helping you succeed. They want you to succeed. Join with over 100,000 podcasters already using Buzzsprout to get their message out to the world. Let's go ahead and create something together. God bless you.